Claire, thank you very much indeed. And if you were watching the number of questions coming in Slido, I think you might be here to after midnight. I know time is a challenge, as always, in these conferences, so I want to keep going. Our next speaker will be Annie Williams, and we thank Annie for stepping in at very short notice. And we would ask her to pass on our regards to Peter and our best wishes as he faces his health challenges going forward. Annie works in the field with both farmers and vets, both in the UK and across the pond in the US, on the complex area of balanced, and I use that word, balanced mineral nutrition. She approaches her work from a strong evidence base, working to ensure high-yielding dairy cows achieve optimum mineral nutrition, and works to the philosophy, more is not necessarily better. Annie, we look forward for you speaking this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. That's great. Right, hi everybody. Yeah, I'm Annie. I'm an independent mineral consultant, so thank you for the invitation to speak today, and I will pass on those wishes to Pete, who should have been here instead of me. I'm going to talk about mineral nutrition in high-performing dairy cows. I'm going to try and focus more on those trace elements, micro-minerals. Claire's just really nicely taken us through those transition cow diets, more focused on the macro-mineral element. But where I want to start is why minerals are important. And I think this is something that I get asked all the time. People always say to me, minerals is a minefield. I don't know what I'm doing. They're either all the same, or this person's trying to sell me this mineral, this person's telling me this one's better. But I think really we've got to go back to the fundamentals of why do our cows need minerals in the first place. And it's exactly the same reason as we as humans need minerals. So minerals are involved in nearly every fundamental process within the cow. So almost everything that we've talked about today, Niall talking about metabolism, Claire talking about hitting different KPIs, using energy protein balances, getting our outputs from genetics, all those processes that are happening within the cow, a mineral will be responsible for part of that process somewhere at some point. So how I like to think of it is a bit like the image on the screen of a car. Our energy and protein is us putting a fuel in. If we run out of fuel, we know about that straight away. So if you run out of fuel, the car's going to stop working. Minerals is like the oil. Oil is keeping everything working. So if we run out of mineral, we don't necessarily know straight away, but we start to see problems, start to see things not working as well as they should be, the vehicle not being as efficient as it should be. It's exactly the same for a cow. A cow can't work with the efficiency she needs to unless we balance those minerals. And like Ian said, I'm going to use the word balance a lot because it's a balance between too much and too little, and we need to try and optimize that system. So this is a diagram that I like to show to try and illustrate that. What we're aiming for is optimum. So we're aiming for the middle of this curve, and we're aiming for that for every mineral, which is challenging because they're all metabolized differently. For some of them, the animal's able to store some of the mineral that we supply. Some of them, they're not, and we need to supply that mineral every day. For some of them, this sort of curve that's shown on that graph is really wide, and we can hit that relatively easily. For some of them, that curve is really narrow, and we've got a real small opportunity between an animal being deficient and an animal being toxic. So on the sort of right-hand side of the graph where we've got oversupply, the best case scenario where we've got oversupply is it's just costing us money. We're putting mineral into that diet that doesn't need to be there. The worst case scenario is we're inhibiting the performance and health of that animal in some way because we are making it so she has to excrete more mineral, or we're putting pressure on her liver because it's trying to effectively remove a toxin from the body. In this sort of undersupply area where we've got a risk of deficiency, we've got animals where we're not going to meet their genetic potential. We're not going to get as much out of the macro part of their diet as we could because they have a short supply of something which is limiting their performance. So what we're effectively looking for is this mineral gap. So we've got, this is the amount of mineral that our diet is supplying. This is the amount of mineral that our cow requires. Is there a gap between the two? Or is there perhaps an excess? Is the diet supplying more than it needs to and is going to impact on those animals? I'm going to talk a little bit in a minute about what I mean by animal requirement, because that's a slightly complex question and maybe an ever-evolving question in the scientific research at the moment. But I just wanted to illustrate that mineral nutrition is really complex. It's not a lie when people tell you it's complicated or it's a minefield, because it really is. This is a list of the minerals that those cows require, and that is a diagram showing you the interaction between those minerals. So getting the balance between them is really challenging. And that balance changes depending on what yields we're expecting, what the genetics of that animal is, what antagonists we have going into the diet, so what other nutrients are impacting the mineral nutrition that that cow requires. What are we feeding in terms of, is it maize silage, grass silage? What's our rumen pH? All that changes those mineral interactions that are happening and make that question even more complex. So the question people always ask me is, how sure are we about requirements? And I think everyone's always hoping that you're going to go, really sure, we definitely know. We know exactly how much mineral we should be feeding a cow. And unfortunately, the answer is it depends. So it depends on the mineral, on the cow. So for some minerals, we're really sure. So I'm going to pick out calcium. Calcium, I am really sure about how much calcium I need to supply a cow with in order for her to produce milk and be healthy and not give her any problems because she's got a calcium shortfall. If you asked me and said, how sure am I about how much cobalt a cow needs? I'm going to go, well, we're not quite sure about that. We are doing a best guess in that all the data that's available out there for cobalt and saying, this is what we think a cow needs, we don't think anything bad's going to happen if we feed this much, but we're not quite sure, and the research is ever evolving. So we can split those out effectively into requirement, adequate intake, and response. So where you refer to a mineral and say, the requirement for this mineral is X, so let's say the requirement for copper is 10 milligrams per kilogram dry matter. That means that we've got enough data out there, there's enough scientific literature, there's enough practical on-farm work where we can be sure that a cow being fed that amount, that is the optimum amount for a dairy cow. Where we've got those that are quoting adequate intakes, that effectively means we're not quite sure. There's not quite enough data out there for us to say, if you feed this amount, you're definitely meeting the requirement of the cow. And that piece of research around minerals is ever evolving. Mineral research is really expensive, which is why that sort of work hasn't been done. Because effectively what we would need to do is say, take a study and feed a cow 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, wait till we hit the ceiling of going, well, actually, at that point, they're deficient. And there we know that that was their requirement. But doing that sort of research is really, really expensive. So we're getting to the point where mineral nutrition is not only a science, but it's also a little bit of an art. Because we've got all those interactions happening. We've got all these differences in terms of how sure are we about requirement. And we've talked a little bit this morning about how quickly those advances in genetics are happening. Those advances in nutrition research are not happening at the same speed. So we've still got this stage where we're saying requirement depends on the mineral we're talking about. Requirement also depends on the cow that we're talking about. And that's where we can move on to a little bit of talking about response, which is probably something that's come sort of into the nutrition community in the last few years. So thinking about, okay, well, we're hitting requirement for this nutrient, but what if we supply a little bit more? Can we get more performance out of that animal by supplying a little bit more because that nutrient's involved in a certain pathway? So where you might have seen some of the latest research on that would be around the area of things like chromium, where we don't think cows become chromium deficient, but perhaps if we supply them with a little bit more chromium, we drive a little bit more performance, a little bit more yield out of those animals. And that I would put in the category of we're getting a response because we're getting a performance response, but we're not necessarily being able to put that cow into a point of deficiency. So when I took this talk over from Pete, he really specifically wanted me to talk about how we look at mineral nutrition on farm. So how do we go about understanding what we might supplement with, whether we need to supplement, what's the most appropriate supplement on that farm. And how I put that is a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. So we need to do a mineral audit. We need to understand what are the cows telling us, but what are the inputs into those cows. So we need to analyze the diet, the forage, the concentrates as much as possible, the water. We need to look at other supplements that are going into those animals. So that could be buckets and licks, boluses, drenches, injectables, all those things we need to put in and say what is the overall mineral intake of these animals and what is it at different points in their production cycle. So how does it vary? How does it vary between animals that are at peak yield, between animals that are close to drying off? How are we changing that mineral nutrition when we get into the far off, close up, dry period, and really understand what our inputs are and what could potentially be limiting those inputs? So going back to that sort of wheel of mineral interaction, understanding what other things could be impacting the mineral nutrition of those animals. And we would refer to those generally as antagonists. So something that stops something else being absorbed, something that interferes with the metabolism of another mineral. That could be another mineral itself. That could be things like rumen pH. And also thinking about what source that mineral is in. Not all minerals are equal. If you're cutting silage and that silage has got a really high soil contamination, your silage analysis might come back really high in cobalt, as an example. That cobalt is probably not available to the animal. So even though it's analyzing as there in the silage, it's coming from the soil and it's essentially unavailable. So understanding the sources of those minerals is really important, and understanding the sources of supplementary mineral is also really important because there's loads in the market. I would be here all day if I tried to explain to you every source of a mineral that's available, particularly into high-performing dairy diets. There are loads, and they do behave differently depending on other aspects of the diet and the source of mineral itself. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. But I think it's really important to understand that, we can analyze animal performance and use veterinary diagnostics to understand this better. I spent all of January looking at mineral nutrition in New Zealand, and they're definitely doing a lot more measuring and monitoring than we are. I wasn't entirely convinced that they were using that data effectively, but they are measuring it, and we can start to do some of that as well. We can really start to get to understand, without too much expense, what's going on in these cows at critical points of the production cycle to get a finer tune on some of this mineral nutrition that we're doing. But I just wanted to highlight some of those differences in mineral sources. I'm going to do a shameless plug because this is my own paper that was published at the end of last year. So this is highlighting differences in copper sources. So the actual data is really not important here, but all it's saying is this is how much you can change copper in the liver using a different copper source. So if we compare the black and grey bars with the two green bars, the two green bars are one copper source. The black and grey bars are another copper source. Where it says plus, that means the animal was challenged. So we've added sulfur, molybdenum, and iron at very high levels into those diets to really challenge copper metabolism within the liver. And what we can see is these sources of copper have not performed equally at all. Everything else is exactly the same. The environment those cows were kept in, the diet, the milking, but these copper sources are wildly different in terms of the effect that they've had on those animals. That's just one example. There are lots of other examples out there. So what I would really say to you is when somebody's coming down the farm drive or you're talking to reps and they're selling you mineral, really challenge them on the data. What does the data support in terms of you selling this mineral? And what effect is that going to have on my cows on my farm? Because they do perform differently. So I just wanted to touch on excessive supply. I said this was going to be about balance. We absolutely don't want to put cows into a state that they are deficient. In fact, I think in terms of when we look at the equations and we're formulating diets, we should be formulating a little bit over requirement. Because if we're formulating to requirement, we'll have some animals within that herd where we're not meeting their individual requirement. But we've also got to be equally careful that we haven't got huge excessive supply. Huge excessive supply, for one, is expensive. Minerals are really expensive. Adding them to diets is a cost on that diet. But it can also affect animal performance. I think we sometimes have this narrative that if a little bit is good, then more must be better, and there'll be no harm in keeping adding more mineral. We now have the data to say that that is not true. That actually, if we put it in excessively, we can have some negative effects. And I'll show you some negative effects in a minute. And then we've also got this aspect of excretion into the environment and potentially incoming policy around things like that and how that's going to affect what we can supply into diets. Because if we're putting it in massive excess, the cow's definitely excreting it. So the one that I wanted to touch on in terms of that we have a lot of data on to show the negative effects of excess is copper. So copper would be generally oversupplied into dairy cows, particularly dairy cows that are fully housed on TMR, perhaps have less of a challenge in terms of those copper antagonists, so in terms of iron, sulfur, molybdenum, than grazing animals. And although it's essential as a mineral, it does have negative effects if oversupplied. And my big message around copper is we have to think of lifetime supply in these animals. So we have to think of calves being born that are born from cows that where their copper status was too high will already have huge stores of copper in the liver. If we continue to supplement copper at too higher levels, those calves that grow into the herd will start their life as a milking cow with an excessive copper supply. And if they enter the milking herd with an excessive copper supply, we do know that has a detrimental effect on their performance. So we do know that it reduces milk yield in early lactation. We definitely know that it reduces conception rates. And we know that is because we're damaging their liver. So because they're storing that copper in the liver, and they're storing it excessively, we're starting to damage the livers in those young animals and have a detrimental effect on their lifetime performance. So copper's one of those where we really are trying to find the balance. We definitely don't want to be on this side. We don't want to be on insufficient, because if we got insufficient, we have exactly the same problems. We have reduced milk yield, we have poor fertility, we have low growth rates, we have an impaired immune system. But we definitely don't want to be sitting on the side of excess either. And a lot of herds, not just in the UK, but across the world, are definitely sitting on this side where we're highlighting that excessive copper is being supplied into diets. So there's some new research happening at Harper to try and give us an answer between what liver copper concentration are we actually aiming for in young animals, because we know what we are in a milking cow, but I don't think we necessarily know when those calves are on the ground as young animals. This is just another example, I think, where we see some excessive supplies is in the area of iodine. So lots of herds being fed above the recommended iodine intake, sometimes as a necessity. I do work with some herds where we do find it's the only way the animals respond, but it definitely shouldn't be being done as routine. Milk is the major excretory pathway for iodine, so if we supply it in excess, we're directly impacting the concentration of iodine within that milk. I just lastly wanted to touch on that aspect that I talked about response. So this understanding of where mineral nutrition is going away from, this is the requirement of a cow. If you hit it, you're not limiting her performance. I think that was kind of the narrative around minerals, that what we were trying to do is optimize mineral status so that we didn't inhibit performance in any way. We're now, I guess, taking that on to the next step, where we're saying, actually, we can tweak things within that cow. We can change things to optimize her mineral status further and get her to respond to certain mineral provision. So a really good example that Claire's talked about in detail would be DCAD. So DCAD is changing our mineral balance in a way that enhances that cow's production. So where Claire was talking about chlorides and sulfur and things like that, swinging the balance of those ions in the blood, that's not a requirement of the cow. You know, she doesn't need to do that. We're not optimizing her mineral status in any way. What we're doing is using something in minerals to get the cow to respond to something we want her to do to optimize her performance. We can do that with others, and we're starting to see that with things like chromium, biotin. Can we get animals to respond to provision of those extra minerals? And I think you'll see more and more people using this sort of term, but I think what's really important is that we think about these three things within it. So we think about the animal, we think about the environment, and we think about whether there is sufficient evidence. So when I talk about the animal, I'm talking about understanding the biological pathway in which we're getting that mineral response. So what is that mineral response driving? Can we understand that in order to understand how we might optimize it? The environment, if we're supplying minerals massively over requirement, what effect are we having in terms of excretion into the environment? Can we start to measure that? Is it justifiable? Is it economic? And then also making sure that we've got enough evidence. Like I said right at the start, mineral research is really expensive. That means sometimes the evidence is a little bit lacking, and I think we really need to push forward on making sure that these minerals are being tested in different types of systems, different animals, different basal diets. A lot of the mineral papers that we would use come out of the US. And we're kind of trying to extrapolate that data into UK systems that are primarily based on maize silage over there, and we're primarily trying to get them into grass silage over here. So understanding whether that evidence is there. But just to give some examples of what we might see if we can get some of this work to happen, would be around zinc. So zinc, we'd be talking about a requirement of around 60 milligrams per kilogram dry matter. But actually, if we start to push these cows up to 90, 100, we can see some responses to that zinc supply. So things like improved nitrogen retention. Going back to sort of talking about protein nutrition, can we understand the mechanism for how we improve nitrogen retention by supplying zinc? Zinc's also been shown to reduce pathogens associated with digital dermatitis, evidence associated for hoof strength and structure, its involvement in lameness, its tie-up with biotin, and also early evidence that zinc and zinc supply over and above requirement could improve meat tenderness. So lots of research coming through. I just think it's really important that we get to the root cause of what is it exactly that's driving some of these things, and do we have enough evidence to start incorporating them practically onto how we manage mineral nutrition on farm. So for just some final thoughts from me, mineral nutrition is really complex. Anybody that tells you that it isn't is lying. It is. It's really difficult to understand, but we do know a lot. What I would just say is we've got to make sure that the research that we're using in this country is applicable to the systems that we're running here and is not evidence that's being extrapolated from other markets. Getting the balance right to optimize the system is critical. So we don't want to be on the side of deficiency. We also don't want to be on the side of toxicity. We want to be as in the middle, as close to optimum as we possibly can be. But optimum in one herd is potentially not optimum within another. Some of those things that we've talked about earlier, environmental challenges, different dietary basal diets, different genetics, can affect where optimum sits within different herds. We absolutely need to think long-term when thinking about balancing diets, ensuring that there's resilience during critical times in the production cycle, so ensuring that the animal remains resilient during transition, ensuring that we're getting calves born with optimum mineral status to really help them get off the ground. And research is always evolving. Knowledge is increasing in feeding the high-performing dairy cow, and I think we'll see it continue to evolve over the next, definitely, 10 years and probably beyond from that. Thank you very much.